Voice recording.
Okay, thank you. So, dear friends and colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome you all at this ICC India webinar on ICC Digital Rules and Practices, current state and way forward. Special thanks to our speakers today, Mr. David Menon, Senior Technical Advisor, ICC Banking Commission and Founder, Trade LC Advisory, sorry, and Mr. Ashwani Sindwani, Chief Executive, FEDAI, and member, ICC India Banking and Finance Working Group and ICC Banking Commission. For taking out time and joining us today. And we're also happy to have a member of FEDAI, Foreign Exchange Dealers Association of India, as a supporting organization for this event. Now, this interactive webinar, I feel, is very timely in the prevailing environment when there is sudden spur in digitalization across the globe. The banking and trade finance industry has seen multiple new initiatives in trade digitalization, both in India and abroad. However, it has been observed that such new initiatives are limited, disjointed efforts on digitalization, and that too by few financial institutions and big corporates and in silos. But I'm happy to point out that ICC has been very active in advocating digitalization, and some of the outcomes of its efforts include Roadmap for Digital Trade and Financial Services, ICC Digital Standards Initiative or DSI, reforming the global trade system, EUCP and EURC, uniform rules for digital trade transaction, international standard demand guarantee practice, and many more. During today's discussion, the speakers will primarily cover ICC digital rules and practices and accelerating digital adoption, including key operational aspects of EUCP, status and highlights of the Urdtd, the market conditions in automated document checking, the next steps of ICC digital roadmap, and much more. Again, thank you to both the speakers for joining us today. And now I will also request, before I hand over to the speakers, is that please feel free to post your questions in the chat option, and we'll take them as many as possible in the Q&A. Now, without taking much of your time, I would like to hand over the session proceeding to Mr. Ashwani Sindwani. Thank you.
Thank you, Imran. And at the outset, I would like to convey my appreciation and thanks to ICC for taking this initiative. In fact, whenever we talk about the ongoing pandemic, we only talk about the negative aspects of it. But one thing positive which I have seen, that having these kind of meetings and discussions and seminars has become much more easier and convenient. Earlier, whenever you wanted to have a conference or a seminar, people were all used to worry about the travel arrangement and all those things. Now it's everybody sitting at their own convenient places. You can join in, you can participate, and that's something I find very useful and effective. And then taking advantage of that, in fact, we and FEDAI had started having our monthly discussion series 5 months back. And every month we have a seminar topic discussion on some of the relevant parts, relevant aspects, which is important for the industry. And this month we are happy to have it in association under the overall leadership of ICC India. So thanks, Imran, for this initiative and for coordination effort. And coming to the topic for the day, we all know that I think there's nothing special I'm going to mention about when I say that trade is an integral part of the global economy, and international trade has really contributed to the well-being of humanity and growth of global economy. But leaving all those aspects besides, when we look at the international trade, we see that traditionally the trade has been very paper intensive, despite its inherent disadvantages. Efforts have been on since over more than 2 decades now to shift away from paper to electronic or digitized alternatives, but we have seen very limited success. And with that kind of thing, there may be various reasons why that it's still not become a widespread. We are not seeing the widespread acceptance of electronic or digitized documentation, documents, etc., and it still continues to be a challenge. I think the reasons are quite obvious, like conservative approach, the lack of legal understanding, lack of uniform legal aspects, technological limitations, or also the involvement of so many multiple entities in that entire chain of the international trade. And it is in the interest of all parties to make the shift happen. And for that, it is important that we all need to move in coordinated fashion and support digitization or digitalization of trade documentation. Many banks, as we all know, have rolled out their own plans and are drawing roadmaps for digitization, sometimes involving tie-ups with fintechs to provide seamless service to their clients. Similarly, ICC also has been very active in advocating for digitalization and coordinating amongst various stakeholders. Range of work undertaken by ICC is very wide, which includes the roadmap for digital trade in financial services, digital trades, digital standards initiatives, reforming the global trading systems, EUCP, EURC, uniform rules for digital trade transactions, Urdtd. All these acronyms may sound for a person like me who has not been in the trade all my career, sometimes very confusing and looks like disjointed. So today, to get better clarity, better understanding on all these aspects and how these things are all converging towards one common goal, we have got with us Mr. David Menel, Senior Technical Advisor, ICC Banking Commission, and founder for Trade LC Advisory Services, to discuss with us and to help us get clearer and better understanding of all these initiatives rolled out by ICC over the period of time in which David has been involved, not only as a participant, but somebody who has been really steering many of these efforts. Thanks, David, for joining us. I welcome you on behalf of ICC India and the entire Indian banking community. Happy to have you here today. And something I would like to share with all the participants that David in the last week only had undergone some surgical procedure, small procedure, and as a result of which he had some problem with his vocal cord in the throat and having some difficulties in speaking. And he has been kind enough to not postpone or not defer it. And he said, we have already committed. There are so many people who have registered for it. Let's not disappoint them. I will make it. So thanks once again, David, for despite all those issues and problems, for joining us today for this session. So starting the discussion, David, I would like to start with that ICC Digitalization Working Group. I know you have been involved in this working group right from the beginning. So if I may ask you, what is the background of this ICC Digitalization Working Group? If you can just share some insights about that with us.
Of course, yeah. And thank you, Ashwani, and thank you, Imran, for allowing me the honour of presenting this to you. I always enjoyed my many trips to India in the past, so being able to join you now virtually is very pleasurable. Regarding the background, well, irrespective of the many advantages that we've seen regarding digital solutions, it's been recognised by the ICC that digitalised trade faced many constraints in rolling out to the global market. Ashwani and Imran already touched on this. So in early 2017, we had an ICC Banking Commission meeting in Jakarta. I think it was our most recent one in Asia. And we launched this working group on digitalisation in trade finance. And the idea of the group is to serve as our coordinating body for all the work related to digitalisation in trade finance, which will be undertaken by the ICC Banking Commission.
So, David, how is this working group structured?
Well, at the moment, this does expand as time goes by, obviously. But at the moment, it comprises two main streams: the ICC Digital Rules and Practices and Accelerating Digital Adoption. The acceleration stream looks at issues such as legal adoption, fintech adoption, which is very, very important for banks these days, and other areas which will help in the acceleration of digital trade. But the rules stream itself examines and develops ICC digital rules.
So if I can talk about the ICC Digital Rules and Practices, that's which seems to be of immediate interest to us, basically, because that's something which we have been just before the start of this discussion as a part of our India Banking and Finance Committee discussion. That was the key point of discussion over there as well. What are the specific areas this particular group is currently addressing?
That's a good question. And it all began basically with a review of all the existing ICC rules that were in place, mainly paper rules, in order to determine whether or not they were e-compatible. In other words, did they work with electronic documents and data? And very pleasurably, we only found two gaps. Most of the rules did cater for electronic. That's great. And the two gaps, one, that the EUCP required an update because it hadn't been updated for some years. And we needed a new set of rules for the EURC, which is a companion voucher to the Uniform Rules for Collections, URC 522. That was where the work started. We're also working, and you've touched on it already, as has Imran, on the development of a high-level framework for rules and obligations covering the use of electronic records to process digital trade transactions. This is the Urdtd. The final version is now with national committees for adoption for the voting. And by the way, just to let you all know, India gave some very good comments. We had 6 drafts of this, and India was very, very proactive in providing us with comments. So we thank all of you for that. And in addition, there's a recent substream we've just established, which is covering an evolving area, which is the automation of document examination under documentary credits.
Thanks, David. Yes, I'm happy that you acknowledge that contribution India made towards it. But at the same time, I must say that some of the comments which we were also learning in the process, and we realized some of the comments which we made, had we had some prior information or prior knowledge or better understanding, maybe we won't have made those comments. Because explanations which we got back from you people made us believe that there was the need to raise this point. This point was abundantly clear, or it was not required, but that's all in the game. And really appreciate and thanks for your patience on that. And your team had been quite active. And I know that you had been steering that group. You had been steering that entire effort as for the Urdtd. And yeah, I must appreciate that it was quite a humongous task which you had taken, and responding to all the queries, all the points raised point by point, and giving explanation. Hats off to your team. Really good. I appreciate that. Now, coming to EUCP, which again, another initiative which you are steering, I think you have been leading that EUCP. What have been the achievements to date about EUCP, if I can talk?
Yeah, well, as I'm sure you all know, the original version 1 of EUCP, is now 9 years old, published back in 2002. But there was very little take-up at the time. I think we realised that we were a little bit ahead of our time. We needed the ICC to put trade rules out there, as we always do, but the market wasn't actually ready. So subsequently, it became very clear that there are also gaps in the rules. And this led to the drafting of version 2, which we published in July 2019, almost 2 years ago already. And at the same time, an in-depth commentary was released. And this has been enhanced with the recent release of an operational guide earlier this year. This is available free of charge from the ICC website. So very helpful if people want to learn more about the EUCP. You can download it.
Thank you. That has been quite helpful. In fact, especially when entire world is talking about going digitization, moving towards digital documentation, etc. This document had been quite useful and helpful. What do you see in the current environment when entire world is trying to move on there? We are talking about digital islands and all those things. What are the benefits of EUCP at this stage? How do you see it?
Yeah, again, another good question. We have to remember that the existing ICC rules, such as UCP 600 and URC 522, are very important to us in our paper world. I mean, the UCP has been called the most successful set of private trade rules ever released, and I think we probably agree that's the truth. But they only provide limited protection when we look at electronic documents. They can help. You could actually issue an electronic trade transaction subject to UCP 600, but there's too many gaps there. And at the moment, we haven't got to a fully digital world, and we probably have moved away from a paper world. We're going towards this mixed ecosystem. We'll have paper and digital. There will be a kind of a spot along the line before we move to electronic documents alone. And by the way, Ashwani, I would say in all of our lifetimes on this call, we're going to see the paper LC for a long time. We all want to go fully digital, but it's still going to be paper for some time. But we can't ignore these digital developments. As to the benefits, well, it ensures that ICC rules stay applicable in a digital world. It helps mitigate risk, not just in the paper world, but also in the electronic side. Very importantly, supports the usage of electronic documents and electronic data. And as with the paper world, the UCP 600 helped us obtain conformity, as opposed to divergent local, national, and regional practice. The same happens with the EUCP, because it helps us have a shared understanding of the different terminologies and the objectives. It gives us confidence in the independent rules. We have the consistency, which I've already touched on in standard in customs and practice, and it helps us around the world in different regions work together for digital trade transaction. Now, it's worth noting that because of this global pandemic, with the COVID over the last 15 months, the EUCP have actually received increased interest throughout 2020 and 2021. There is a growing realization by practitioners that paper documents are causing delays and disruptions.
Very, very true. I think we can all relate to it. The banking industry is undergoing a digital transformation as customers are today asking for better solutions at a faster speed and unfortunately also at a lower cost. And the only way forward for us in this environment to survive is to go digital. And I don't think anybody will question that the pandemic has provided an unprecedented acceleration for the digitization. Digital technology, which was so far being seen as a cost saver before the pandemic, is now being seen as a key enabler for the business. And in fact, the communities which are not having access to the technology, they are facing more challenges. They are feeling left out in this race of the acceleration which we are seeing. And that kind of scenario is for a practitioner. For what is your recommendation, or what kind of preparation you would suggest for a practitioner one should implement in order to be able to use the EUCP more effectively?
Yeah, there's a few areas really. I mean, operations, the obvious one, technology, legal, risk mitigation. With regards to technology, it's an obvious point, but people forget it. It's essential that companies ensure that their internal data processing systems can handle the relative formats for electronic documents. They can authenticate messages. They can execute electronic signatures. The rules, as always, of the ICC are technology neutral. So it's up to the parties concerned to decide the most appropriate method of processing. Once they've decided, they must agree between that with each other. There's no point one bank and one corporate saying we can do this under a certain platform when everyone uses a different platform. You touched earlier on digital islands, which is still a big problem, Ashwani, as we know. Too many of these digital islands can't talk to each other. So make sure you all have a shared platform. Very, very important. On the legal side, as far as we know, and there's been a lot of research on this, there is no conflicts between the EUCP and any e-commerce laws globally. But we do recommend that banks do review your internal client agreements just to make sure everything's okay. And for risk mitigation, whilst we assume that banks and companies have their own internal policies that cater for digitalization, it's always useful to review your handling guidelines just to make sure that the changes in processing practices can be accommodated, and they also cover any additional risks that could be relevant to the transaction processing. It's not an onerous task, but it's something you do need to look at.
Okay, so keeping aside the legal aspects for the time being and technology, you mentioned that yes, it's technology agnostic and interoperability and all those things are there. But keeping maybe that point, we'll take it up during the course of the discussion further. So as of now, if I'm getting you right, is it correct to say that operational aspects is presumably the key to ensuring that ECUP transactions can be processed? That's the key area right now which the banks should be looking at, more concerned about operationally. Handle it?
Yeah, definitely, Ashwani, it is, no doubt at all. And if you want to gain optimal benefit from the rules, it's important to take into account the implications of the EUCP when you're issuing your documentary credits, to allow for presentation of electronic records rather than paper. And of course, bear in mind, the EUCP does allow you to present electronic records and paper documents together. So because we do have this hybrid system, that's going to be the first one we have. Now, if you don't take this into account, you will negate many of the benefits. But the fundamental requirement, and everything derives from this, is for the applicant to jointly agree with the beneficiary of the credit that presentation of electronic documents will be permitted, and then to determine which documents can be handled in this way. It's necessary then during this dialogue that the beneficiary provides reassurance it can present any required electronic documents and that such documents will be in an acceptable format. Now, it should be noted that prior to any companies finalising this format, it needs to be determined that such formats are also acceptable to the issuing and nominated banks. there's no point the beneficiary and the applicant saying we can accept this particular format, then the banks can't accept it. So everybody has to agree, which tells you that the format of the electronic record is actually the key to the entire process. Now, there is an article in the EUCP that discusses this in particular. And in this article, it states an EUCP credit must indicate the format of each required electronic record. And if the format is not indicated, it may be presented in any format. So I think you can see from that if a format's not stated, then the relevant banks and ultimately the applicant and the beneficiary take on any resultant risk. So in view of the fact that data processing systems are unlikely to be able to access all formats, it's really essential that any data received is readable by that data processing system. So as usual with a letter of credit, it's then incumbent upon the issuing bank to determine the workability of the applicant's instructions before they issue the credit. And this is particularly vital for credit subject to EUCP. Not only does the issuing bank need to determine and validate the instructions are workable, it needs to ensure the bank itself can handle the credit. And the same applies to the nominated bank, which could be advising, confirming, or any other type of nominated bank. They need to ensure they can act in a nominated capacity. So important to review the credit, make sure a bank can meet any EUCP requirements, but the format of the electronic document is the key. Make sure you understand what format's there and that you can process it.
That's very important. I think the key to the entire issue, because we traditionally have been used to looking at and processing data or information from the paper document as a human being. Now we have to look at whether the format or the data, my machine is able to read it. I have to give it the format or the standard thing which can be read by the machine, not by the human being sitting over there. So unless we are able to, that's the key point basically, which I see you are bringing it out. And that takes me to the next initiative, which we talked just before at the beginning also on Urdtd, which I think is complementary to this entire thing which we're talking about, which is something which makes it even more clearer and for a better understanding, some more explanation or elaboration on that. So that's something which you mentioned at the beginning also. Imran also made a mention about that, and right now in the process where the local committees are voting about that. So what is the background of that initiative, and something about that would you like to share with us on Urdtd?
Absolutely. I mean, the ICC highlighted a couple of years ago that a single trade finance transaction can require more than 100 pages of documents. And they believe there's more than 4 billion pages of documents currently circulating in documentary trade around the world. And you can't even begin to think of these figures. But when you do start thinking about it, just imagine how much cost that's proving to exporters, to importers, to banks, to everybody. So it makes it very, very clear that there's a need to develop a high-level framework for rules and obligations that cover the use of electronic documents to process digital trade transactions. And draft 6 was the final draft, which, as I mentioned earlier, has already been distributed to the national committees for approval.
Yes, I think June 29th is the last date for the final verdict from the national committees to be submitted.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm sure that you will be, unlike some of the previous occasions, you will be getting the inputs from India committee also on that.
Great.
So, and I totally agree with you when you talk about that the type of kind of paper which is being consumed and the environmental impact it is having. And now when we are talking about all environmental sustainable growth and the carbon footprint, etc., that's something which, if I may use the word, sounds all looks criminal. And if we can find a way out of that better way, it's always welcome. And if I'm not mistaken, recent study by the World Economic Forum and the United Nations, which they mentioned that trade digitalization could reduce the annual trading cost by something about 7 billion.
Yeah, it's an amazing figure.
It's an enormous amount, and increase the exports by around 257 billion in Asia alone. Look at the total volume which it can go up by bringing in the efficiencies, etc. And the UK, I think, alone was talking about they can generate an economic growth of something around 25 billion if we move to entire trade into digitized form, which is too big a number to be ignored and to look at. And obviously with that kind of reward, if I may say, that kind of upside when we are having. There is no reason why there should not be full scale effort on that. So coming back to URDTT, can you provide us an insight into the composition and structure of URDTT? What is it? How is that entire thing structured?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the rules obviously cover the digital trade transactions, and a digital trade transaction is one which evidences an underlying sale and purchase of goods or services and the incurring of a payment obligation. Unlike that, I mean, I'm sure most of you remember the URBPO, the Uniform Rules of Bank Payment Obligations, which weren't as successful as any of us would have liked, various reasons. But one of them is that the it was only bank to bank. The URDTT extends into the corporate space. So it's bank, corporate, corporate, bank, the four-corner model that we all understand. And it also includes this massive expanding community of non-bank providers of financial services, the fintechs, which we cannot ignore these guys. They're increasingly important in our trade world. All data under the URDT must be submitted in the form of an electronic document, an electronic record. Unlike the EUCP, where you could have paper and electronic, that's not the case of URDTT. It's all electronic. In essence, a digital trade transaction is distinct from the underlying commercial contract. It is autonomous, as it should be. It's the process by which the terms of the commercial contract are recorded and progressed. It is very important to note that the underlying contract is supported by contractual performance and not by the conditions of the digital trade transaction. As I said, they are autonomous. And a digital trade transaction includes a payment obligation, which moves from conditional to unconditional once the appropriate electronic records, as specified in the digital trade transaction, have been submitted. Very similar, by the way, to a letter of credit.
How does this entire URDTT fit in with the EUCP version too?
Yeah. Well, the scope of the two sets of rules is different. The EUCP really is a supplement to UCP 600, and it's designed to accommodate the presentation of electronic documents, which is normally scanned images at the moment, under a documentary credit. And the EUCP will actually continue to exist in its own right, alongside URDTT. By the way, we have actually thought about this in the Digitalisation Working Group and tried to look way down the road. One day, will we have one set of rules that covers everything? Maybe, but that's nirvana. At the moment, they're still separate.
Okay, just one thing more which comes to my mind. As I mentioned that just before we started this meeting, we had our working group discussion, and one point which came up over there, one of our learned member pointed out, was that you also made a reference to that about URBPO, which has not been a great success because of certain things. What is the difference between URDTT and URBPO? How it is, we feel it's a step forward, or maybe it is going to succeed, where URBPO failed?
Yeah, and to be honest, it's actually quite basic. The scope of the URBPO is limited to bank-to-bank undertakings in support of collaboration between participating financial institutions. And that leaves the banks to compete in terms of their corporate service agreements. That seemed the right way to go at the time when we brought in URBPO. And of course, we were basing much of our work upon the Swift transaction engine at the time, which was bank to bank. But we quickly realized that that's not what the market wants. So the difference is it's a four-corner model rather than just bank to bank.
Okay, that we are learning in the process, basically.
Yeah.
We are all learning and improve. No, how is the concept of confirmation handled under the URDTT?
Yeah, that's, again, a very good question, and something we spent a lot of time thinking about. We couldn't ignore confirmation in the electronic world because it's still be there. It's a risk mitigator. It's needed. So, but the word confirmation was difficult. During the drafting of the rules, we concluded that this word confirmation had too many inferences and connotations, not only to documentary credits, but also to the paper world. So we couldn't actually use it, even though it was, to be honest, our preference. But it just wouldn't really have worked as a digital term. So in response to this conclusion, we brought in a new term, which is a financial services provider payment undertaking. That's now the electronic equivalent of the paper confirmation.
Okay, so there is some improvement on that front also. So, and when we are moving on to from paper, which we have been traditionally dealing in for the last so many years, and there is a basic degree of comfort. I'm not saying that's a perfect system. There have been slip-ups, there have been frauds, there have been some mishaps in that also. But when you are moving on to the digital world, in your opinion, how does URDTT help in prevention of frauds?
Yeah, so it does concern us all. Thankfully, we're quite lucky in that fraud is not that prevalent in our trade transactions that we see, but I agree, we can't ignore the fact it's there. So does it prevent fraud? Well, it would be far more difficult to have fraud in specific electronic records presented under the digital trade transaction than in today's paper world, provided there's adequate authentication practices. Paper is still too easy to create a fraudulent document. That's not to say that we can eliminate fraud from all transactions just because we have electronic presentations. But I would argue that the possibilities for fraud have now become far more limited.
Right. So one thing which is coming to my mind based on the discussion what we are having, we are all talking about digitalization and accelerating the entire process, which so far what we have talked in terms of EUCPO, URDTT, etc. The communication from client to the bank and bank to the client, that piece of communication is getting faster, quicker, instantaneous, if I can say, if it is having electronically. Now, after that, there is a lot of work, lot of process which happens within the bank. And I believe that unless we are able to accelerate or expedite that process, cut down the time on that, ultimately we are not going to be achieving any great thing over there just by accelerating or cutting down the time on one part of it. The processing time the bank takes also need to be curtailed, need also to be turnaround time has to be better. And that's one point which came up in the discussion. We noticed that in URDTT, the time for processing the document, which unlike in all the other things, URDG or UCP, it used to be 5 banking days. Here we have given it as a 2 banking days. So which is a big ask for the banks, and obviously some of the players are concerned about that, how we'll be able to turn around in such a short time, because we have been used to that 5 days. And with that thing, I'm sure that automation or document examination is also very important. We need to automate our internal processes also as well. And I believe ICC has got another work stream, which you also mentioned, which is looking at automation of the documentation document examination under the documentary credits. So is that the thought process same which I am elaborating, talking about, or was there some other rationale for taking up this as a project at ICC?
Yeah, again, very good question. Going back first of all to the URDTT, where we talked about processing within 2 days, this was not a kind of date we pulled out of the sky ourselves. We asked national committees for their feedback, and the consensus, the average was 2 days. We have to see how that works, Ashwani. We don't know. But regarding this new work stream, the automation of document examination, I think we don't. Whilst it's a critical aspect of the documentary credit cycle, it's well recognised that the examination process under documentary credits is not only time consuming, but it's very costly. And even more importantly, it really requires a solid base of experienced staff who we have to keep retraining and keep finding in the banks. And the key reason for this is the paper. Simple as that. And there was a paper someone released last year at the ICC. They spoke about paper being the Achilles heel of international trade, and it really is. But the fact is, recent and ongoing digital developments, and I'll talk about things such as the optical character recognition, OCR, artificial intelligence, machine learning. These are all new technologies that are coming into our banking world and increasingly into the trade world as well. And they're now creating a new environment in which the time we take to examine paper can be significantly reduced.
And what is ICC doing in this regard? Is there?
Yeah, but the objective is to produce a set of clear guidelines on how trade finance document checking can be automated using these new technologies, such as the artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc. And the workstream has so far, and we consulted with ICC national committees first, of course. We produced an information paper which provides background on recent advances in this field, together with an outline of the expected benefits. And in addition to that, which we hope will assist organisations in understanding where they are positioned, we've included the automation matrix within that paper. Now, it's important to take note of the fact that solutions actually already exist, which can support the use of the technology to really improve the efficiency of manual work. They're already out there. This paper that's been produced is intended as an informational guide to those solutions that are currently available. But moving forward, we want this paper to be used proactively, not just by the ICC, but by national committees and by banks and by everybody that's involved in trade. We want to encourage organisations to explore how automating the document examination process can reduce cost, their own cost, everybody's cost, and a reliance on this laborious manual processing, basically, that we have. We also expect the work stream is going to produce an FAQ document in order to help practitioners. But this really is such an important area because it's going to happen. That's a fact. We can't forever stay with paper document checkers for so many different reasons. And one of the main ones is trying to find new people all the time, Ashwani, in the banks. And I worked for Deutsche Bank for many, many years, and trying to get new guys into this paper world isn't that easy because it's not very interesting. But you ask these new people to come into a technology world, machine learning, AI, well, we like that. So this helps.
That's very true. So now I'm getting the feel of how enormous and complicated, complex this entire task about digitalization of the international trade is. We have talked about the ICC Digitalization Working Group, the digital rules and practices, and EUCP, Urdtd, and then automated document verification and checking. There are so many different areas, but at the same time, what is coming to my mind as an overarching framework, I believe that ICC has also produced the digital roadmap about this entire process. Can you provide some insight, some details of that particular document, or what is that about? And
yeah, I'd love to. I mean, I mentioned earlier about this estimated 4 billion paper documents circulated in the trade system. With this single trade transaction needed 100 pages of documentation, taking weeks to process a transaction instead of hours. So again, it just clearly identifies this need to create a more seamless system, which will increase the trade flows, less barriers, far less inefficiencies. But the problems we have seen are quite considerable, and there's three main ones. The first is a non-alignment of national laws. And most national laws around the world are still not aligned properly. We can talk about this a bit later, I guess, in more depth. Lack of connectivity between technology platforms. You mentioned earlier the digital islands. They're still there, these digital islands. They can't talk to each other. Quick pointer, by the way, we were talking about the digital islands back in the 90s, that far ago. I remember at Deutsche Bank when we created our first electronic trade platforms, as other banks did as well. And we'd have these big clients say, look at our new platform, it's wonderful. Yeah, but Standard Charter's got one, and HSBC's got one, and Citibank's got one. We can't buy all of your platforms because they don't talk to each other. So it's not, this digital islands is not new. We've had them for quite some time. And then the biggest point, I think, the insufficient common standards, digital standards. So the focus of the roadmap, which was originally produced by ICC UK and has now gone global, is to provide a framework in which to align objectives between stakeholders, including government, industry and key trade bodies such as the ICC, and this roadmap will clarify the division of responsibility between these stakeholders.
interesting. So if I'm not mistaken, this particular step would fall under the second work stream, which was accelerating digital adoption of that digitalization working group. What is the ultimate aim for this roadmap? What are we looking, what are we trying to hit? Target?
Yeah, I would summarize it as it's threefold. Depends on the party involved. Number one, big one, government. Very, very big. Update the legal infrastructure. As most of you probably know, there was a meeting in the UK in the last couple of weeks, the G7, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, UK and US, and they agreed a framework that will champion the work of the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, UNCITRAL, who we all know very well, and promote the adoption of its model law on electronic transferable records. This is not just a small move forward, it's significant, it's giant. We've got the G7 to agree that the core model law that we use in our banks, which underlines, by the way, EUCP, EURC, Urdtd, They're now going to update legal infrastructure to accommodate this. This is a fantastic move forward. And it really should not be underestimated. For industry participants, participating in digital solutions, piloting new technologies, and for the ICC, prepare for new technologies and develop rules and standards as we're doing already. And make sure we have collaboration. Corporates, fintech, shippers, insurers, everybody all work together.
Oh, I can see when you are mentioning about all these areas and the things which digital roadmap is trying to achieve, this is somehow looking like exactly the mirror image of the problems we are facing back home here in India. The issues which we are grappling with, the problems which we are struggling with. So that with that kind of feeling, I would like to take the discussion to our own backyard, to the Indian context, if I may bring it over there. And just a little brief about that. Like any other market, banks in India also are in working in tandem, in coordination with that fintechs, and have successfully undertaken, mostly on bilateral basis, international trade transactions in digitized mode, fully digitalized mode, and same time also parallelly maintaining that traditional paper trail also to satisfy the local regulatory requirements. But at the same time, these transactions still date are restricted to a few large corporate buyer, where buyer as well as the seller has got the capability and mutually agree to deal on these terms. Still, if I say the market infrastructure legal framework, that is not geared to where we can adopt or switch over to these kind of transactions in the large scale basis. But at the same time, India has made significant progress in digitizing its local trade. Today, if I can say that we have got e-invoicing, we have got e-way bill, which is already a standard practice for the domestic trade, and local digital infrastructure, the technology adoption by the market participants is, the level of adoption is adequate and is already catering to the domestic trade in paperless mode. Majority of the India's domestic trade has already gone paperless, thanks to the coordinated effort between various agencies over here. And with banks as well as the large corporates have created technological capabilities and are ready to make the switch from international for the international trade as well. If we can do that for the domestic trade, there is no reason why we can't do that for the international trade, but for some additional requirements, additional features which we may have to build in over there. Today, the custom department for all practical purposes has gone paperless. Maybe the system is a hybrid model, which is combination of scanned copies of the paper documents, PDF versions, etc. The challenges which I can share with you, if I can list down 3 key challenges that Indian players are facing today. One is that interconnectivity, interoperability between multiple systems. You mentioned that digital islands under various stages of development, which are there with varying degree of sophistication. There are so many different disjointed efforts which are happening, and these are not able to communicate with each other. These are not interoperable. So those are the issues, the first point. The second problem which we are grappling with is that how to integration with the international framework and ensuring that our local digital framework or the standards are aligned to the emerging global standards. How do we make sure that we are all moving in the same direction? It should not happen that we are moving in the opposite, or that instead of converging, we are diverging over there. And the third is about the legality of all these documents. The key over there being the legal acceptability of the electronic bill of ladings. So in these issues, would you like to share what are the things you are facing in the other markets and how ICC's initiative can help us overcome these problems?
Yeah, well, I'm just smiling as you were saying this, because the issues you're facing are exactly those that we're facing everywhere in all markets. So we face it on a global basis. So yeah, I guess in one way it's good to see we all have the same problems, because it means we want to get a solution together. So, but it's still frustrating. I fully agree. And we've touched on it already. This interconnectivity really continues to be a challenge. These digital islands are a great problem for all of us, and we have to overcome this. And as I touched on earlier, I'd argue it's been an issue since the gradual emergence of independent e-commerce solutions back in the 90s with these proprietary bank solutions. The issue's always been these solutions cannot communicate with each other, which means corporates have to install multiple platforms, not cost efficient, not effective, and just not part of the future. We cannot go on that way. So part of the work being undertaken by the ICC Digitalisation Working Group actually examines this issue. And the aim is to develop a catalogue of best practices in order to create standards. One substream is actually currently discussing the draft principles for standardisation with an initial focus on standards for guarantees, standbys, and export letters of credit. That's going to help all of us on this call for sure. With respect to the global standards, you obviously are aware because you mentioned it, the ICC has launched the Digital Trade Standards Initiatives, this DCI, which is based in Singapore. It's a collaborative cross-industry effort to enable the standardisation of digital trade. Now, it's intended that the DSI will build on work already done by various like-minded initiatives, many of which aim to digitise trade, notably through the development of open trade and technology standards to promote this required interoperability. So they're not starting with a blank piece of paper. There's quite a lot being done out in the market and they can leverage upon that. DCI also promotes greater economic inclusion through development of open trade standards. This will mean that we get a facilitation of the technical interoperability among all these different blockchain-based networks we have out there at the moment. I guess in the last 2-3 years ago, most of us hardly even knew the word blockchain. Most people really didn't, to be honest. Now, even though we may not understand it, we know it's there. And we know it's something that we can leverage upon in the banking world. So ultimately, the aim is to ensure that all the foundational standards that are required to digitise trade have been defined, that they're accessible globally, and can be leveraged by all participants, be they in the UK, be they in Australia, be they in India, it doesn't matter. We all want these same standards. So if you do it and I do it, we know we're working on the same platform. You also mentioned the legal acceptability of electronic bills of lading. This has been a subject of a previous report that the Digitalisation Working Group produced, I think a couple of years ago, on the legal status of electronic bills of lading. And the responses in that report showed that the legal rights associated with traditional paper bills of lading are well established. However, and not surprisingly, the legal status of electronic bills of lading is very unclear. Now, most of the 10 countries that were covered in the report, and these countries, I've listed them here. I've got a list of UK, US, Brazil, UAE, Singapore, Germany, Netherlands, Russia, China, and India, have some form of legislation allowing contracts to be created and signed electronically, but only the USA currently has any specific law that supports electronic bills of lading. And it may be in some circumstances possible to establish rights based on electronic acknowledgements given by carriers, but there's no clear pattern on how that actually will work. Looking at India itself, the specific feedback I've seen highlights that Indian courts previously continued to insist on the same evidentiary requirements as laid down in the Indian Evidence Act of 1872, which is based primarily upon paper records and oral evidence. Sounds like the Bill of Exchange Act of the UK, 1872, whatever. I mean, we're really relying on such ancient rules in all of our countries at the moment. However, in India, and they took their cue from the Winter Trial Model Law and e-commerce, and there was an Information Technology Act of the 2000 enacted in India with an objective which brought into effect the amendments to certain legislations, including the Indian Evidence Act. So by virtue of this statute, I believe it can be said that legal recognition has been granted to electronic records and digital signatures in India. Now, there may be others in this call that know far more than me on this. I think that you're possibly there. Obviously, I'm no expert in Indian law, but I have been made aware that the enactment of the IT Act does grant legal recognition to electronic documents. It lays down broad contours which ensure the genuineness and legal acceptability of electronic documents in India. So the presence of the content of the electronic document does appear to be legally recognised, and a bill of lading in electronic form would seem to satisfactorily meet the stipulations of the statute regarding digital signatures, admissibility, etc. So you seem to be there, I think, Ashwani, but say others know far better than me. This is my understanding from my brief research.
That's quite comforting to hear from you that you feel that India is already there. Though here, when we talk at the local legal firms over here, the opinion is divided. People are not very comfortable or confident about that. That in case there is any dispute it will pass the muster. That's something which I think is happens in anything new when you enter into it, and that's the way the entire legal system works and functions. So with that thing in mind, in fact, in our local national committee also, there's the point which we identified to work on, and I would like to have your views as well on how can ICC, based on your experience in other locations, help India, help us in timely adoption of United Nations Commission of International Trade Law or the model law on electronic transferable records, which is from the UNCITRAL and model law adoption of that. And also, as you mentioned, though you feel it's already there, but still there are some concerns addressing the legal issues around acceptance of electronic bill of lading, bill of exchange, and other documents in digitized forms. And also about improved coordination between various stakeholders, regulatory bodies, statutory bodies, banks, and maybe the shipping lines and freight forwarders, customs, and so many data sharing platforms are over there. How to create a kind of digital ecosystem in international trade, communicate with the cross-border systems, and also interoperable, as I mentioned, and technology agnostic. How do you think ICC can help us progress in that direction and reach to the destination?
Yeah, and the inter-tribal law on electronic transferable records, which I touched on earlier, abbreviated as MLETR, is a key document for us, all of us moving forward. And in fact, I touched on this earlier, we've modelled most of the definitions within EUCP, EURC and Urdtd on those included within the model law. Now, at this stage, as far as I'm aware, only a few governments have adopted the MLETR, one of which is Singapore. I think Bahrain have also started. But there is a very aggressive initiative by the ICC to call on governments to align to the MLETR. As I mentioned earlier, regarding the G7 meeting, where the UK was the host, this has now been adopted as a G7 priority. So all the counterparts in the G7, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, UK and US, have now agreed a framework that will champion this work, the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, and promote the adoption of its model law on electronic transferable records. And of course, Japan, Australia and India were also at the meeting. We had a G10. So once again, India is very, very closely involved in this. So I expect, as you know, as you're working now so closely with the G7 on this initiative, that's going to make a massive difference in your country. I'm absolutely no doubt about it. We're already seeing lots happening in the UK at government level. Much has been pushed from the ICC UK, from their original digital roadmap that we've discussed, from which all of this basically evolves. And through timely intervention with different government parties and different government departments, we've seen this really creep through. We're quite confident, could be wrong, but we're quite confident that the elements of the model law that we want to see adopted will be done in the UK by the end of this year. And that's really aggressive for a government. It does require our government to do it, but with at latest first quarter next year. So we think that will happen. And with the G7 and now the G10, with Japan, Australia and India involved, if we can get these 10 countries moving forward together, then we're going to get a global domino effect. There's no doubt about that. It's intended that the UK business case for this model law alignment that's been commissioned by the ICC UK will be published, will be promoted as a tool for other countries, and I've no doubt that you guys are going to see this as well. I've already touched on the electronic bills of lading and other documents, and the Digitalisation group does continue to maintain this as a core ongoing issue. We have to, because if you can't turn everything digital, it doesn't work anyway. In fact, the working group's already providing continued assistance to the UK Law Commission in drafting new laws on electronic documents. And this work will also be made available as a model for other countries, including yours, in order to pursue your own legal establishment. The fact the ICC UK, run by Chris Southworth, have gone through this process already, they've already seen the barriers they're going to hit in government. And they're going to be able to advise you on how to overcome those. So that's going to be very useful. Always having someone else that's gone through it, most helpful, because you can avoid the pitfalls. Then the final point, I guess, possibly the most important point of all when you look at it in the long run, coordination among stakeholders. It's the only way we can succeed with any of these initiatives. And a separate work stream is actually examining the issuance of guidelines that parties in the trade finance ecosystem, digital ecosystem, can use to connect with each other globally. And this will be published later this year, followed by communication across different various platforms to create awareness. So you will be seeing something later this year, Ashwani, on that side of it.
Great. And I must say that the recent announcement by the G7 ministers about their commitment to move towards the digitalization was really a big boost for this entire effort. And now with India also joining the G7 as part of G10, I'm quite hopeful that, yes, that will give a further push to all the efforts being put in by various agencies in that direction. And now I think we are already running as per our time. Our time is sort of up. Maybe we would like to have some time for the question and answer also. But I would love to have this discussion because there is so much to talk about. There are so many things we have talked, and thanks for your kind of clarity which you have provided on so many aspects. I can see how all these things moving in a various stages and various pace, how they're all converging towards one single goal. Otherwise, every time we used to get confused, they used to be look like we talk about the digital islands. To me at least, these used to look like a disjointed effort. I could never relate to the picture. Now with all these things, you have given us the big picture, and as you mentioned already that some of the countries like Bahrain has already adopted the model law, Singapore has already adopted the model law, maybe as part of G10, India may be the next one. With this, I would like to stop here, David, our discussion maybe, and we'll open the forum for back to Imran, maybe if some of our participants, some of our attendees may be having some questions and queries which they would like you to address. Once again, before I pass it on to Imran, I would like to convey my personal thanks, regards, and appreciation for your time you have given to us and for the inputs which you provided, sharing your thoughts with us. Thanks a lot, David.
Well, it only works, Ashwani, if it's mutual. We needed the dialogue to get this work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you. No, of course, it was very engaging. I myself feel very, enlightened because, as Mr. Ashwani already pointed out, that so much issues on coordination and whether this will work or not. But now, as you've given the big picture, I have a better grasp of where we stand. And my colleague Utpal will be moderating the question, and I see a lot of interest. A lot of people are asking questions. Utpal, are you there? So how you want to proceed? You want to ask the question, or just go ahead.
Yeah, so we have received few questions. I'm one by one unmuting that particular participant, and so that they can pose their questions, and accordingly the panelists can take questions. So first of all, I am unmuting Ms. Binni Pavitran.
Hi. Hello.
Sorry. Yeah, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Yes.
Hear.
Okay. I think pretty much you answered all the questions that I had put in the chat. My question is more related to how what is the plan of ICC to bring in all the people involved, all the stakeholders involved in the entire ecosystem of international trade together to accept digital documents. That's one of the questions that I had. I think you answered most part of it earlier. So yeah, if you can just give some insights, it will be great.
Yeah, I mean, this all gets controlled basically by this ICC Digital Roadmap we spoke about. And this has gone out to all ICC national committees, and all ICC national committees should have distributed this to their memberships, which is banks, corporates, fintechs, insurers, whatever. The national committees play a very key role in this. ICC globally can coordinate activity. What we need is national committees to coordinate with their own membership. So therefore, we need to understand the problems in the UK, the problems in India, the problems in New York, wherever. And we need these national committees to feed that back to the main digitalisation working group so that we can address them, then push it out to governments, etc., etc. So the key is absolutely getting all the stakeholders together, but we can't work in isolation. we need the national committees to play the biggest part here, because you as national committees have the biggest involvement with your own national, with your own exporters, importers, traders, etc. So that's where we see the coordination must start right at the bottom, getting the countries together. You decide what needs to be done in your country. You feed out the problems to the ICC in general, and that can then be fed out globally throughout the world to the different organisations, such as the World Trade Organization, such as G7, etc., etc. So we need to go at the bottom first, find out where the problems are, then feed them up. But the coordinating body we hope on this is the ICC Digitalisation Working Group. That's at least is the intention.
Okay. Next question is from Mr. Narayanan. I'm unmuting you. Please go ahead. Mr. Narayanan. Okay. So Mr. Cyrus Master. Okay, he has also left. Bhaskar, are you there?
I can see Mr. Cyrus Master's question on there, which is how far is blockchain technology on the trade ecosystem? I think that's the question.
Yeah. You can answer that, David. Thank you.
Yeah. Right, blockchain. There's a difference of opinion. I think if we look back 3-4 years ago, we saw blockchain, or as it's distributed ledger technology, and it was brand new to most of us in the trade world. It's been around for some time with cryptocurrencies, etc., data mining, but it's one of those things we weren't sure about. But based on the different initiatives we've been seeing over the last couple of years, I think there's no doubt that blockchain technology will be the basis of the future, the trade ecosystem. It's independent, it's trusted, it's neutral. So yeah, I think it will become more heavily available within our digital trade solutions as time goes by. Even within 12 months, we're going to see a lot more. There's lots of solutions out there you may have heard of, such as the Marco Polo, WeTrade, where all different banks are working together. All of those are based upon blockchain technology. So yes, it's going to be very, very important to our trade ecosystem. And in fact, that's just reminded me, I came across something only yesterday regarding blockchain technology, trade, and India, which may answer your question for locally. And if you'll permit me to read this, because I wasn't even aware of it, it's headed up that 15 banks form a new company to process letters of credit in India using blockchain technology. And this is 15 banks that formed a new company with a focus on using blockchain technology to process letters of credit for domestic transactions in India. According to a report by the Economic Times on Tuesday this week, 10 private sector banks, 4 public sector banks, and a foreign bank have forged the Indian Bank's Blockchain Infrastructure Company, IBBIC. And the company's new system will verify data for invoices on goods and services and e-way bills, eliminating paperwork and significantly reduce transaction times. The banks I've got here, RBL Bank, ICICI Bank, HDFC, Kotak Mahindra, Axis Bank, IndusInd Bank, Yes Bank, South Indian Bank, Federal Bank and IDFC are the private ones. The public sector banks are State Bank of India, Bank of Baroda, Canara and Indian, and the foreign bank is Standard Chartered. So you seem to be moving ahead very quickly here on the blockchain. So to answer your question on blockchain, yes, not just globally, but in India, it's going to be very, very important in trade.
Just to add on to that, David, what you mentioned, this company right now, yes, you're right. This company has been registered in the month of May. It's going to be operational soon. And to begin with, it's going to be focusing on the domestic trade, obviously with an intent to expand it to the cross-border trade as well.
Yeah, I was really interested to hear this. It's the sort of thing I want to see happening in every country, because this is where we will really get somewhere now.
Okay. So, Bhaskar, you want to ask your question?
My question is related to the curtailment of doc checking days. At present, it is 5 banking days, and for a site payment, LC, applicant generally makes the payment on the 5th banking day. However, site means the payment becomes immediate once the documents are certified as a clean. If we curtail these to 2 days, will the applicants be in a comfortable position, because the electronic documents will move very faster than compared to the physical mode of documentations? And the second question is, how compatible our bill of exchanges will be as a electronic document?
Yeah, well, the first question, this curtailment, how we say, we have 5 banking days of paper documents, 2 banking days for digital documents, which seems on its face to be appropriate. But you're absolutely right. I mean, this is a new world. Is it going to work that well? Will 2 days be sufficient? Maybe 2 days is where we will get to eventually. Now, as with any set of ICC rules, we need to remember that you can modify or even exclude certain articles. So if the parties involved in one specific transaction think that 2 days isn't enough, then all you have to do in your letter of credit or your trade transaction is state that for this particular trade transaction, it won't be 2 days, it will be 3 days or 4 days. Eventually, the market will find its right place as to where it should be. 2 days is the consensus of the national committees at the moment. That's what they wanted. And so that's why it's there. Market practice itself will tell us what's right or not. So there's workarounds in the meantime if we don't want 2 days, if we want a bit longer. But in due course, we will find out which is the most appropriate. We also have to bear in mind, very importantly, that dropping from 5 days to 2 days may seem quite dramatic, but it is paper to digital, so it should be easier. But we also have to take into account our competition. It's not just banks that handle our trade business now. There are fintechs, there are others that do it as well. We have to compete with these people. If we say that if you send us a digital trade transaction, it's going to take us 5 days to process it, and XYZ fintech says, well, we can do it in 24 hours, where's the corporate going to go? Quite possibly to the fintech, and we lose the business. So we have to be competitive here. But the bottom line is, anyway, yes, 2 days is the recommendation in the rules, but you can adapt that, you can modify that if need be. Sorry, I've forgotten the second question. What was the second question?
Second question is related to bill of exchange. How compatible it will be as an electronic document?
Yeah, really good question. And one, I'm not a legal expert, so I can't talk too much about it. But I know work is ongoing, not just in the ICC, but globally, looking at electronic bills of exchange and how they will be applicable in the future. It's work that the ICC UK, I know, I've been looking at very closely. We mentioned earlier about some of these ancient statutes you have in India. Well, some of ours in the UK are just as old. The Bill of Exchange Act, I think, is 1884. And it talks about paper. And yet we have electronic bills of exchange now. How do we make an electronic bill of exchange work under the Bill of Exchange Act? It's not that easy. So yes, there is ongoing work looking at statutes, looking at legislation to try to bring countries into the current world that we live in now. It's totally absurd that in the UK, we're working on a statute that's, what, 137 years old. I mean, come on, absolutely crazy. But that's the way it is. That's how it's worked out. We are changing it now gradually. So it's a good question from you. I can't answer it clearly, apart from to say it's been examined, that it will be addressed.
Arul, please ask your question. Arul?
Hi, good evening. Actually, my question on ML-ATR has already been answered, but I'd like to ask a further question, if I may. While there is a digitization of transaction or trade document is happening, I want to take your opinion, David, on the payment systems. When there is a faster transactions or being created, faster transaction processing are being enabled, will what will help on the payment systems, likes of CBDC, how the CBDC is being explored by various banks? What do you think it will complement the Urdtd and other digital initiatives in trade?
And to be honest, the ICC rules that have been developed and are still being developed, such as Urdtd, do not address this issue. For the simple reason that ICC rules and practices must be neutral. platform neutral, technology neutral, payment system neutral, whatever. So yeah, I don't see a problem in the URDTT, sorry, in any platform solutions, payment platform solutions being used as the processor for a payment obligation originated from the URDTT rules. I can't talk specifically about individual payment platforms because it's not something we've looked at. It's not something we can look at because we have no control over it at the ICC. They're completely independent to us. So can you use SWIFT? Can you use whatever? Yes, almost certainly you can. I can't talk about that because it's not something we examine within the rules themselves. It's not our business to do so.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so next question Vidya wants to ask, is the proposed changes in the UK law going to be the inflection point in the digital trade as compared to the decision on MLETR adoption by countries?
Yeah, I mean, what's happening in the UK, I'm personally very pleased about. I mean, we've already touched on the fact that UK law can take forever to change. It normally does. But for whatever reason, the UK government, UK departments have recognised that if we need, as a country, we need to be competitive in the future, we can't just sit back and do things that take 10 years to change anymore. We have to do it quickly. So yeah, I expect this to advance UK trade enormously in a very quick time because digital documents will be acceptable under law in the UK. That will make, and earlier on Ashwani spoke about some figures globally and for the UK, and the figures are mind-blowing, to be honest, but they're actually true because I've seen a study behind them. So yeah, these changes in law will be enormously beneficial. I want to mention one thing about MLETR, which is the core of all of this, by the way, the underlying framework, how it works. You don't have to adopt MLETR in total in order to bring these changes in. Singapore, Bahrain and others are doing that. In the UK, for instance, we will assimilate the key aspects of MLETR into our existing law. That's how we will do it. So you don't have to bring the whole law in as one thing straight away, dump that there. That's not easy, actually, to adopt an entire brand new law. What you do is assimilate pieces of that law and push it into your existing law. That's where it really works. So you adopt different parts of it. So in the UK, I believe that will be done by the end of the year, latest first quarter next year. And I am aware I'm talking about government, and it isn't always that quick. And even in the UK, we've had lots of problems in the past because of this. But we seem to have a government that's in place, very importantly, for the next couple of years without changes. That's going to help us enormously. Whether that, in summary, adopting the MLETR or taking aspects of the MLETR and bringing them into your statutes, into your legal statutes, is going to bring enormous benefits wherever you are in the world. It doesn't matter where you are. I think in India, as I touched on earlier, you've possibly already got many of the benefits already. Whether they are actually properly enacted in legislation, I don't know. My research seems to think they are. So you may actually be ahead of us already, which will make it even easier when you, as part of the G10, bring in these new digital solutions. Ashwani, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that one.
So if you allow, can we take the last question of the day?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So Senthil, please ask your question.
Yeah, this is Sendil. Actually, I have concern with this current experience we are all facing because of this COVID-19. All things we are expected to be digitalization. As far as trade is concerned, based on this experience, do we have any plan in future so that we can process our trade transactions without any interruptions?
I'd say that the ICC roadmap is there, which is in place to take us into a digital world where everything we do is totally digital and no paper whatsoever. But that is an achievement that can't be done within 12 months, maybe even a couple of years, to be honest. We will have this hybrid ecosystem along the way where paper still exists alongside digital. And that's going to be I think, the next 3-4 years, I would say, are paper and digital together, side by side. maybe in 5 years, we could have full digital on many of our transactions. By the way, that's not going to be the case globally everywhere. I unfortunately predict that in 20 years' time, we will still see numerous paper letters of credit around certain parts of the world, because there are various reasons why certain countries just won't move to the digital side. We have to convince them of the benefits. But I think in 5 years, we're going to see this tipping point where more and more of our trade actually does move to the digital world. And so, yeah, that's my prediction on it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so just do the vote of thanks. I would like to, on behalf of ICC India, I would like to thank Mr. David Mail, Mr. Ashwini Sindwani, and the participants for all your support in hosting this webinar. Actually, we had somewhere close to 220 plus participants today, and this is one of the achievements. And I'm sure it's just because of both of you, both of the speakers, we got such good audience, and particularly Mr. Amainel. Thank you for taking us through the workings of the digitalization working group, key operational aspects of EUCP, highlights of Urdtd, and various other things, and the ICC digital roadmap, and much more. So thank you for that, and especially Mr. Sindwani, you were putting all your questions in such a way that it was very much interactive, and I'm sure all the participants throughout the session, they enjoyed it. And hope for audience, I would suggest we will be hosting many such events in the coming months. Stay tuned, stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Utpal.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, David. Thanks, Imran. Bye-bye.